Hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get started in just a minute. I am just checking my audio settings. I think I got my settings a little bit messed up to begin with, so I think we are all set. You should be able to hear me. Thank you all for joining today. I'm going to get into securely testing and deploying your application. So this is I think this is kind of the two topics that I love to talk about, especially testing. I come from a testing background and have spent many years focusing primarily on software testing. So I think that this is one of the streams that I'm really excited about, one of the topics that I'm always excited to talk about. And it was interesting to do some learning around testing, not just as it relates to like how to build an app that is reliable and works as expected, but also to make sure that the application is secure. So really kind of approaching testing from a different angle and looking at a security viewpoint. And then there's also going to be kind of the release or deployment part that we'll talk about and kind of how to keep security top of mind throughout that as well. So that is kind of the goal today. I hope that you all are doing well. This is now our 5th stream in this series, so you can always find the other past streams at the Microsoft Reactor YouTube. These have all been on YouTube Live. So if you want to check those out, you always can and go back. And of course, you can always reach out to me and chat about security stuff. So that's kind of the picture of what to expect today. Just wanted to get into that starting off. And then I think with that, I'm ready to go. So yeah, let's do it. I'll switch over to the PowerPoint. Give me Okay, so yes, you should be able to hear and see me on the PowerPoint now as well. All right, just cool, double checking. All right, so we have so far talked about security fundamentals, planning and setting requirements, the design phase. Last week, we talked about how to have secure coding practices during the development phase. So again, this is all about securely testing and deploying your applications. It's really essential once you get to the testing phase. Of course, while you've kept security top of mind, all those other phases, it's really important to have a process to thoroughly test your application. So I'm going to talk about some of the strategies and different types of test and what you might do to kind of really have more confidence in your application that it's going to be reliable or available. It's going to protect your data so that things remain confidential. And just really perform exactly how you expect it to. And kind of, this is another opportunity and, the last opportunity before things are live to your customers that you have to make sure that everything is working really well. Because you don't want to get to deployment and find out that things aren't, because it's a lot more expensive once things are in production to kind of go back and fix problems and figure out just what went wrong, right? So it's really all about doing as much as you can throughout the software development lifecycle. So this is kind of what I was just visually going through. And yeah, we're really focusing on those last 2 cycles today. And I think the 4th one, the test one, again, is really where like you are cementing these security practices by the time you're releasing. That's always an opportunity for things to go wrong, of course, but by releasing, it should be an exciting moment to just kind of put your application out into the wild and know that you've done everything that you can to have a secure app. So let's go ahead and focus first on testing. And I will try my best not to talk through this section really long, since again, I am a really big fan of testing processes. But really here, it's all about verifying quality, reliability, and security of your application. There are loads and loads and loads of different types of testing that can be done. So I'm going to talk about, just a handful of the top ones, the ones that I would recommend most. I think, if you are familiar with the just working on a development team, or yeah, that's probably the best example I can think of. Working on a development team, you might be familiar with some of these testing processes. So we can just go ahead and get into them. I will say the only other thing, like as a preface before I get into types of tests, that you should think about what types of tests are you going to perform. I don't think you should get to the testing phase and then make that decision. So, this might be something that you even recognize, or not recognize, but determine in the design phase perhaps, or maybe even planning and setting requirements. But very early on, you should already have an idea of the types of testing that you want to do, so that by the time you get to the test phase, you're already kind of set. You have a plan in mind about how to execute that. So just making sure that's clear as well. So I'm introducing test types, but by this point, you should already know what it is that you're going to be testing and how. So first up, I wanted to call out the different types of automated testing tools. And this was something that I covered in the secure development stream, the last stream. So we talked a little bit about this, around what are some of the different types of tools that you can use. I think that these are all, there's a lot of options here, and I called out kind of the category of them here. And there's a lot of different options that you can be going for, whether if you want to analyze your code, if you want to scan any third-party tools, since an application is nowadays made up of a lot of third-party tools and code and libraries and things like that. It's important to think about how to verify that those don't have any vulnerabilities. There are specific web app scanning tools that you can use, web API scanning tools that you can use. So there's all kinds of different ones here. Last week I did show, one second, I had another browser window up that I didn't want to show yet. This is the OWASP, Open Source Application Security Tools. So there are a lot of great tools listed here based on the different categories. We did talk through some of these. Then they could be good to check out for your application. I think the benefit of these tools, these are all free for open source. So, number one is you have to be working on an open source project, but the benefit is these are also free and open source tools that you can integrate into your projects. That I would highly recommend checking out. And I haven't used all of them. I probably haven't even used most of them, but I think this would be something else really good to keep in mind, just a resource. And again, you might want to think about what are the types of these testing tools, and what are the types of scanning that you want to integrate, when you get to the testing phase. And I think that this actually can happen during development or testing. I think probably, when you're setting up your application, even before it's ever been released to the public, you're going to want to think about how you're going to set up your kind of like build and test pipeline, and which ones of these testing tools you're going to be running often. So kind of getting everything in place to be able to run these tests. All right, and now I want to specifically get into different types of testing, and these are going to be, tests that are actually written for your application, whereas the other kind of tools that I was describing were about things that are going to run for you. They're going to do some kind of scanning, report generating for you. This type of testing is crucial to a part of any application development, but these are tests typically that your developers write or your testers or QAs write. I wouldn't even say, security folks write these types of tests, but this is going to be, an opportunity definitely to get input from security types on your team or in your organization, especially, early on as you're thinking about, okay, what are the tests that I want to have? What types of scenarios should I think of? It can be super valuable to work with security team members to get ideas of scenarios and just to remember what to test. So keep that in mind as we go through this. But something that I did want to call out was the test pyramid. So the test pyramid is something that is used, I think, very widely in the testing community at least, but this is just a nice representation to think about the types of tests that you can have and the attributes or behavior that you want them to test for. So typically you might see these 3 layers, but there can be a lot more. The bigger idea here is to keep in mind that the bottom level, the unit test, is usually always at the bottom, is where you're going to have a lot of tests. These are going to be more isolated, where they are testing smaller components. They take, a matter of milliseconds to run. They're very fast. And as you move up this pyramid, the types of tests that you introduce are going to require a lot more integration. So you have to think about, maybe not just an isolated test and how that works, providing an input and output. You might have to think about other systems that can get involved and that you're trying to test as part of like a longer and larger, more involved test. So as, again, you go up the pyramid, they're going to be more integrated, and in that case, they're going to be slower, especially if you're talking about needing to test between different components or services or APIs. They're just inevitably going to be slower, and you're going to want to have less of those tests. So just important to keep this in mind, I would say. Let's go ahead and talk about unit test. So in more detail than what we saw in the test pyramid, unit tests are really broken down for every single component and function as part of an application that should be tested. They verify the smallest units work as expected. So yeah, I think a general rule that I keep in mind for unit test is that every single function should have at least one test, I would say, because you do want to consider covering kind of both the happy and sad path test cases, especially with these kind of unit tests where you are almost encouraged to write a lot of them just because they're quick. They can really give you a lot of information about if functions are working as they should be. So you can think about covering different scenarios, like what are going to be the successful cases, what are going to result in some errors, and I want to confirm also that these errors are happening, or that this this result is happening incorrectly, I guess. And I think for that reason, they serve as regression tests. So regression, just thinking that if you're always running these tests, and for unit tests, you pretty much can always run the full suite if there are maybe hundreds or thousands of these tests, because it is quick. So you want to run them whenever code is being changed. This is going to be in a development environment, in any staging or production environment perhaps. And you're going to want to do that because you can catch anything that goes wrong. So that's kind of what the idea of regression testing is. If you knew that they were passing, but then you made some code change and later they're failing, you have to think about what code started to break your unit test. All right, so next let's get into integration tests. So thinking about moving up the pyramid, integration tests are going to have, a little bit less isolation. Here you're thinking about 2 or more of different pieces of your application coming together. It's about kind of connecting one system to another system. For example, maybe your web app, like your front end with the database as a backend, maybe doing some testing of APIs or different web services. So there are options here and lots of layers, but it's really about 2 or more of these systems, services coming together and making sure that they work together. So integration tests are really cool. Like if we think of an example of a unit test, for example, maybe we're wanting to we have a function that adds something. Let's say you can create some kind of blog post or something. So you might have a function that is literally testing, can you call this add function and will it create Will it give you back some kind of like blog post object or something? Will it actually start to create that? Does the process of creating happens? Whereas like with integration testing, you might take that a step further to say that when you are actually trying to add or create this new blog post, that it then gets saved to the database, for example. So you're not only testing just your application and what happens there, but also what happens at another service. All right, I'm going to keep going, just checking for questions. And next, let's talk about manual. So I think this is where I'm starting to deviate from the test pyramid a bit, but with manual, you can kind of imagine this at the very top of the pyramid. This is something that is going to be slow because it's actually not an automated test. Maybe it sits on top of the pyramid almost, but I would say that this is a very, very valuable type of test to perform manual testing. To think about all of the following. So performing testing on different environments, for example. So maybe you have a development environment, a staging environment, multiple staging environments, even production. For that case, it can be extremely valuable to do testing there. All right, and you want to think about performing multi-browser testing. So really just thinking about the most popular browsers that there are, you know, not only really focusing on what your primary browser is used. Sorry, I don't know how to phrase that. Not only focusing on kind of your most popular browser that your users use, but also thinking about all the other kind of main browsers. So Edge, Firefox, Safari, Chrome, all of those, you want to perform some type of testing. And you know, you might have some kind of like a checklist of items that you're going through, some kind of test scenarios that you want to go through and look for. That can be a great place to start in doing that testing. Also, when you're doing this multi-browser testing, think about using developer tools and really seeing what can be manipulated there. You can look for all kinds of things like hidden fields or ways to kind of expose data or inject data, do some cross-site scripting or things like that. So this also would be a great place to have some kind of like almost checklist of things that you might try to do for, so that you can generally kind of perform, or at least keep the idea in mind about the same types of testing that you should be doing. Along with that, you can think about using web proxies, so ways to kind of intercept HTTP requests in your application. So you can, you know, maybe find ways to do this in the developer tools and kind of intercepting the request there, or you could also use other tools for doing this kind of proxy testing. And then the last one along with that is to do some kind of fuzz testing. Which again, I think, you know, these three here, when using developer tools, web proxying, and fuzzing, all go along with each other, because here you're really trying to see what you can exploit or what can go wrong that, you know, maybe the system wasn't designed for. So providing any kind of random unexpected data that's going to wreak havoc on your system is really what you're trying to do here. You can try this on pretty much anywhere that accepts user input, even in the URL bar, for example, but on any other kind of inputs. You can also be looking into like cookies that are going to be shown in the developer tools. And yes, HTTP methods are request. So what I mean by there is if you do have let's say I'm going to focus on a specific example. So even I was just mentioning, like, let's say that we're going to have this system where we can add a blog post. So even like adding or creating, with that action, you are sending a post request, which is kind of like posting some new information to your database, or you're like putting it there, as maybe another way to think of it, which is another HTTP method. But in this case, you are sending a request to some kind of API endpoint that might be like create post, maybe it's called something like that, and you're sending along data with it. So it might have information about like who you are as a user submitting this data, what the post is named, or what content the post has. So you're sending over a bunch of data like that. And so what I mean about using a web proxy to manipulate the data, for example, even if you are sending a post request, you can think about maybe, hey, I want to try to like manually do this request. So I'm not really doing this through a UI. I'm thinking about kind of manually hitting the API to seeing ways that I can like send data that doesn't necessarily belong along with that. Maybe I'm trying to say that like I am creating this post as another user, or maybe I'm trying to send along something that I shouldn't in the post. So either like data that might be like prevented otherwise if it was, sent through the UI. You might try to do things like that to get around different checks that are in place in the UI. But yeah, I hope that helps explain some kind of the HTTP request. Other popular ones are when you're getting data. So anytime that you might be retrieving data, so say that there are posts and then I want to go back and get my post, that would be another time where I'm actually like retrieving data. And in that situation, maybe I'm trying to retrieve more data than I should get back, and just see what else I can get from the database. Please remind us what fuzzing is. So yeah, maybe I went over that a little bit fast, excuse me. So it's really about providing any kind of like random data, or just really doing what you can to almost like any place where you might be able to input data. So I think that this is on the UI level, so any other input fields, URLs. This can be on the back end, so through the developer tools console, like trying to manipulate fields that are there, trying to look for hidden fields. And it might help to see some of this. There was something that I wanted to show. And thank you for the questions. Please feel free to keep those coming. So let me hop over to my browser. And there was something that I wanted to show here. It's something that I brought up before. And I actually have the link for it, so let's just go there. It is the Juice Shop. So this is a tool provided by OWASP, and I'm going to go ahead and drop that link in here. So this Juice Shop app is a web application with a vast number of intended security vulnerabilities. So this could be a really great place for anyone kind of coming and wanting to learn more about security vulnerabilities. So especially I'm talking about manual testing now. I think that this is a great place to think about how you might do some of this manual testing. So a few things that I was just calling out, for example, so say I right click and inspect this in my browser to bring up developer tools. Dev tools failed to load. That doesn't seem good. Did it fail to load? I want to bring this down. I'm used to having this down here. So my console was up there. Can I just close that? Yeah, that would be great. So you might want to look in DevTools. There's lots of information that you can find here. Typically what I'll always do is start with kind of this view where I can just go and actually inspect different elements and maybe just get an idea of what information is here. Even from this, what information I might be able to manipulate. I don't know if there's much that's interesting here. Maybe I want to go to account, login. Login is a great place to think about what fields that you might be able to manipulate in some way. So this could be a great place to just enter in a bunch of like random data and like see what goes wrong, any kind of like escape characters or anything that might cause some havoc when you're logging in. You might want to try something like that. But it's really just about kind of experimenting, but really starting here. You might just, again, look at some of this, look for any like hidden fields or anything in here that might be something that's commented out. I do see an example of a returned HTTP post request that returned a 500 from that invalid login that I just did. I can look at the sources, the network, all kinds of things in here just to try to like get a little bit more information, see what I can manipulate. Go and look at the cookies, see what cookies there are, which are there any now? And try to kind of get information from that. So it's really just a process of like messing around or trying to mess things up essentially to cause something unexpected. And I think really the big purpose is like getting data that you shouldn't be able to get would be a big one. Yeah, so I would check that out. I also see someone is saying damn vulnerable web app is also a good place for testing. Let me look that up and see. Or if you have a link, you can share that in here too. It might be this one. I was checking it out before I shared just to not be sure what I was getting into. But I think that you might be referring to this, which looks like it's at dbwa.co.uk. Is a PHP MySQL web app that is damn vulnerable. So yeah, this can be a good one. Like I love tools like this and Juice Shop. Any kind of like free standing web apps that will really give you a chance just to like explore to your heart's desire and to try to find vulnerabilities and to find places where things can go wrong are really great practice. All right, so I think just a couple more types of testing that I wanted to talk about were, let's start with performance and stress testing. So I will say that the next couple types and the last types of testing that I want to talk about for now, just saying again that like, you know, these are maybe the first three that I called out, unit, integration, manual, are tests that, you know, don't need to be performed by security professionals. And I would say especially unit and integration are not. Those are typically always going to be written by developers, maybe with input from security folks. Manual testing can still be performed by developers, testers. I think it is a lot of times, especially testers. But again, I think for that in particular, it's really important to be familiar with security fundamentals and be familiar with ways that you can try to exploit the system and get data and manipulate data. So those are kind of the difference there. These next three are almost always going to need to be performed by some kind of like professional at this. So like a performance tester, someone who is like a security expert that has really a good eye for like performance and stress testing. Here the idea really is all around keeping your application available at all times. So you're going to want to, with performance testing, kind of measure responsiveness, reliability, and quality. Those are kind of the big benchmarks that you're looking at. And mentioning benchmarks, there might be some benchmarks for an application that you need to kind of keep within. So like you want to know that pages load in this much time, that requests are returned in so much time. Like generally you might have some benchmarks that you want to stay below, and that's going to be like everything is great. And when you go above those benchmarks, are kind of like thresholds, even is another word you might look for. That means your application is not performing well. And I think along with that, with stress testing, it's, you know, all about kind of knowing how much stress and load an application can handle. So with this, it's really about how your application can experience the maximum load and knowing what that maximum load is and still being able to work properly. So I think that these two go hand in hand together. With performance and stress testing, you're kind of doing different things. Performance is more about like constantly measuring and monitoring your application. Stress testing, you might not need to do so regularly, but you do at least want to have an idea of how much your application can handle, know that it can handle kind of like your expected max. So think about like, what do I think the max number of users are going to be doing? What are they going to be doing? Thinking about like, okay, if I do have this kind of blog post system where people can upload blog posts, like how many can they upload at a time before the application suffers in performance or even crashes. So these are some of the important things to think about in terms of performance and stress testing. Again, with the idea of knowing how to keep your application available at all times. So one other thing that I'll call out here is thinking about like, what is the maximum load and what happens when your app does go beyond that maximum load. Is there a way that you can kind of scale up on demand? Is there a way that you can scale your resources to just do whatever you can to keep your system up? Or thinking about just creative ways in case you reach kind of that maximum point. Okay, cool. Just checking if there are any questions. The last two here kind of go hand in hand that I'll talk about. So first is thinking around a security assessment. And this can be something that would be a good idea to start with. Again, maybe before the first time that you actually release your application into production or to the public for the first time. You might want to start with a security assessment. So, the thing is you need an application that is pretty much built and at a good state that like could be ready for production, but it really involves a security expert at this point coming in and trying to find every possible security vulnerability or problem, checking that every security control has been properly implemented, ensuring that the different role and access settings of your users are correct, and just confirming that things work as expected. So not being able to kind of manipulate data, do things that you shouldn't, get access to parts of the site that you shouldn't, do any kind of HTTP interception or things like that. But really it's going to be a full assessment of your app and trying to find all the things that could be wrong. And I will say could here because really you're looking for like every possible vulnerability or problem. This could result in some false negatives, but it's really kind of supposed to be more encompassing rather than not, just to give you an idea of like possible problems as well. The purpose is really trying to find security problems, present them in a report, classify them depending on some kind of level of risk if that's available, and maybe like provide information about how you might fix them. So not actually fixing them, but it's really about like creating awareness of things that can be exploited and what you might do to fix them. So that's the security assessment. And I would say this is not something that you need to do often, especially, if you are releasing your application and you don't expect some of this kind of like core functionality to really be changing. This could just be a good thing to do like one time or every so often. Maybe every so often means like when there is a big change that you're expecting in functionality. And then the type of testing that kind of goes along with this is that you might want to consider is penetration testing. So this kind of goes a step further than a security assessment, where here, like, yes, you're trying to exploit your system, and yes, you're revealing what risks exist, but it's also about actually going ahead and fixing those exploits that you're finding. So I think the difference here, outside of kind of like fixing those exploits, is that like what you have typically is some kind of like ethical hacker that you're working with to do this exploitation. So they will go and kind of confirm, right? Like security assessment is more of like a just that, like an assessment, a scan, and kind of looking at things that might go wrong. This is actually making things go wrong, I guess, and then providing the fix for that. So those are kind of the differences between penetration testing. So I feel like this goes a step further, and in reality is probably more helpful to have someone who's actually like confirming all the exploits and kind of coming up with fixes and implementing those fixes, maybe along with the development team. But yeah, this does take it a step further. And I think will ultimately leave you with the most confidence in your application. And also maybe like a security assessment. I don't know if this is something that you need to do that often. I think it maybe just depends on what's changing in your application. But penetration testing is going to be pretty in depth. It is going to involve fixing a lot of exploits, so this might not be something that you want to do so regularly as compared with unit and integration testing, where you're pretty much running all the time. Anytime that you're changing something, that gives you the immediate sign that at least like something might be wrong with your application. Whereas I think some of the larger security risks, you maybe don't need to perform as much in-depth testing all the time. So I hope that makes sense. Let me check for any questions, if there's anything that's coming up. Next, let me get into deploying and releasing then. So deployment is really all around how to release the application to production. This is the super exciting point because it's the culmination of hard work and all your good processes throughout the software development lifecycle coming to life. So yes, the most exciting step, because this is also when customers actually get to use your app. Probably could be a little bit of a scary time too, because again, by then you kind of hope that you've found a lot of these exploits, you have put in steps to prevent them, you are aware of like everything that can go wrong. It doesn't mean that things won't go wrong, but just acknowledging that when you're in production, that is kind of going to be the most expensive time to discover problems and things that can go wrong and try to like fix exploits that come up when your application is already live and in the wild, and there are going to be some hackers out there. So for deploy options, there are many ways to deploy and release new versions of your application. I only included a few here. I would say that there's just seriously such an abundance of different ways that you can deploy your application, from pushing a button to uploading a build or a version of the application to automating everything. So I think some of that is like very broad. So I don't know if I should provide some examples here. Thinking about maybe pushing a button, like literally just that, like you are pushing a button from maybe from like your IDE, or even from like a continuous integration or development environment, where you might have like kind of everything in line and you're just pushing a button to almost like trigger the release, or have that application actually be like released into production. Uploading a build or version of the application, this makes me think of something like a GitHub release. So maybe it's not actually like a web application, maybe it's more of like a desktop application, which I think that's something that the GitHub releases do really well. But there, for example, you're like uploading a release package. Automate everything is probably maybe the most straightforward one there, where literally like your code is just always ready to be in this deployable state, and it is maybe just deploying on its own. So those are some of the 3 different options that I think of. There's probably some more. I don't know if any more are coming to your mind, throw them in the chat and let me know. But I think I'll just get into recommendations here, understanding that there are so many ways to do this. And I'm going to be opinionated here, having done lots of releases. I would say that it's important just to have a streamlined process, and in order to kind of like nail this process down and really solidify this process, it's probably going to take time. It's going to be a learning process, but there are some questions that you might want to think about to help guide this process along. For example, what testing needs to be done before a release. So not necessarily identifying like the types of testing, or not thinking back to the test phase. It's not about like, hey, okay, we need to write test. It's about like, what are the tests that actually need to be run. So, you know, that again might be your unit test, that might be your integration test, or like some kind of like subset of that. But anything that is going to kind of give you that little bit of more confidence before you actually have the release. So what level of testing, and you know, it probably is some sort of like manual testing too. I think that's super, super important, especially on a staging environment, or like the environment right before you get to production, is being able to do thorough testing there. How will the release be validated? So I think that this goes along maybe with the third question as well, and maybe these first three kind of all go together, honestly, the more that I think about it. So like, how will it be validated? So again, what other level of testing needs to be done? What other kind of like checks need to pass before this is actually able to be released? Does anyone need to like actually manually sign off? Is there someone who's going to like have the final say? For example, about like, is this release good? I have worked on teams before where like there is actually a checklist before a release goes out, and like someone, maybe like the product owner, actually does come and confirm like, yes, it's time to do the release, like, or you know, you maybe want to coordinate everything, so you do the release, then there's like a blog post that goes out and more promotion. So it might be important to have some kind of like actual sign-off process. Is there a set release cadence? So can your app just be released every day, multiple times a day? For example, like if you have a web application, if you have like a big web application, you have a good process, it's possible that, you know, they can be releasing new versions multiple times a day. It's possible that you are maybe only releasing a new version like once a month or something. Maybe you want to schedule some downtime around this release so that you can do extra testing. I feel like probably we've all used web apps at some point that say like they're down for maintenance. You know, it can be maintenance, it can be putting in new versions of the application or some systems. So thinking about that and maybe scheduling that if it needs to happen at a set time. And then how will the app be versioned? So thinking about like, is this a minor release, a major release, how you're going to actually update the versioning, because that's important, right? It's important especially to know like if you know, an issue is found in a certain version, that when you release that new version, that issue should be fixed. So versioning is super important for a number of reasons. That was just one small example, but these are some of the questions that I think about and that I've seen come up really commonly in release processes. All right, so the next point that I'll talk about, and recommendation rather, I guess, is to really make the process automated. So first you want to think about kind of like how to make it streamlined. You want to get your idea together of what the process should look like from end to end. And then once you have that in mind, you can really focus on automating as much as the build process as possible. So this is going to involve running the builds, running the tests that you need to run, doing any kind of deployment to staging or testing environments, things like that. Can even involve the release. Some manual verification is okay. So if it doesn't involve the release, like you should try to make things as easy for yourself as possible. So going back, like maybe your automation is doing the versioning, maybe it's doing and including any kind of like sign off other processes or like kind of checklist of items that I mentioned before. So any of that should be automated, I think, whenever possible, just to involve less kind of human intervention, which is always a good thing, which means that inevitably less things should go wrong. And yeah, I think those are the big tips, but yeah, probably starting with the process, automating as much as that as you feel comfortable with. There are many tool options for automating build, test, and deployment. I can show off a few of those tools momentarily, but yeah, it's probably important to think about what tools work for you and your team. Again, there are like a number of open source tools that I would recommend first, open source tools that you can just use for free. But if that doesn't work for you, there are other kind of more closed tools that you can work with as well. Like Jenkins is a big one that comes to mind. I've used Jenkins a lot of time, which involves like a lot more setup, but the good thing is that you can like host this somewhere like internally, so you know that it's secure, that no one else can access your build system. Or there's a lot of different kind of like open tools that you can use. For example, like Travis CI might be one. GitHub Actions you can start using for free, I believe. It might have some kind of like paid components to it. Azure Pipelines, you might have to pay for the resources that you're using. So those are just a few options that come to mind. And then I do want to specifically talk about using CI and CD pipelines. So I've kind of alluded to that, and as far as like what is a good deployment process and automating a number of things. So I think that this is important to just think about, and I want to just break it down really quickly so that these differences are clear. So continuous integration, kind of focusing on that left-hand side with the big blue rectangle about it, is really around building and testing and being able to merge any code changes to the main branch as often as possible. So anytime that you're changing code, likely multiple times a day, that continuous integration should be happening. And really the important thing here is that developers' changes are being validated. You know that your application is still functioning as you expect it to. Continuous delivery is the next stage that I'll talk about. So kind of focusing on this top level here, or this top kind of row, where there is a lot of automatic processes. So acceptance test, we didn't really cover that. There are like different names for this too, but these might be kind of like the extra test, or just like any extra verification that you want to do to verify your build. Then there might be some deploy to staging, a staging environment just right before production, a very production-like environment where you can do even more verification, maybe some more builds and tests are run there. Then there's this deploy to production, which is a manual process followed by smoke test. Didn't really talk about that either, and this is kind of just an image. I agree with this image, but people do this differently. So just an idea to get to picture how this works. The idea of smoke test is that maybe you're just running a few more tests, a few more crucial tests to confirm everything is okay there. This could also be a great time to do manual testing after the deploy to production. And then the only difference with continuous delivery is that all of this is automated. So with continuous deployment, I might have said that incorrectly, I'm sorry. Continuous deployment, it just takes it one step further than continuous delivery, where it completely automates everything. So I think I mentioned some applications that are deploying to production multiple times a day. So that's kind of the model to look at here. If you feel comfortable to do that, if you want to deploy multiple times a day, that might be, kind of the best option. But this is kind of an example just to illustrate the difference between continuous integration, continuous delivery, and continuous deployment. This image comes from Atlassian. Atlassian explains this really, really well, I think. Just checking if there are any questions about that. So yeah, I think I would definitely, again, recommend doing this here. I will point out that this is something that I would recommend like all development teams do. I think, just to call it like testing is something that I think all development teams should do. So maybe by this point there isn't so much that like a security professional is getting involved in. I think the point here is, again, going to having little to no human interventions, having a nice automated process, working with a trusted CI/CD pipeline provider where you don't expect anything to go wrong in the process or someone to kind of come in and be able to manipulate your application in some way. So there are things to still consider and security decisions to make around deployment. But I would say it's kind of like a big DevOps-like process and not like a big security process. But again, security decisions can still and should still be made in this process as well. And I'm seeing if there are any questions, because I think this is all that I really wanted to share. I will pop back over to my browser in the meantime, because I was looking up CI/CD tools. I just kind of threw out a whole bunch of different names to them, or names of different tools. So Jenkins is a big one, which, sorry, I think I misspoke. I guess it is an open source automation server. So maybe the difference here is that Jenkins, and the way that I've used Jenkins, and maybe there's just a lot more flexibility here and kind of what you're able to configure in your pipeline. So typically you do have to create your own pipelines and do a lot of configuration. There's a lot more flexibility because you don't have to use this in the web. You can kind of like set up your own offline server, which is pretty cool. Circle CI is another good one. I haven't used these other three. I was also recommending Travis CI. I would also check out Azure Pipelines as another one. Yeah, and this is another really great option to build, test, and deploy to any platform in the cloud. They do also have a GitHub integration, which is cool. So your project can either be in Azure DevOps or Azure, or GitHub, sorry. Mixing up my words here. And then I think the last one that I had mentioned was GitHub Actions. But yeah, something to look into here. I guess this is just a blog post, but okay, now supports CI/CD, free for public repositories. I think it is paid, however, for non-public repositories. But there are so many options out there. I think it's up to you. I might kind of go first with like the pipeline that might be closest to kind of like my development tool chain, for example. So again, if I am using Azure DevOps, maybe I just want to use Azure Pipelines. If I am using GitHub, I can use Azure Pipelines. I can use GitHub Actions. You might just want to use something that's very close to your development process already. Oh, is pipeline just another way of saying the bigger picture of all the steps? Essentially, yeah, essentially. Thank you for reminding me to explain things better. But what I mean by that, like, so if I look at this first row here, either the first or second row, these steps kind of make up a pipeline. A pipeline meaning build, test, acceptance test, and so on. Like the kind of end-to-end process there is a pipeline, where each one of these are actually, what are those called? Are those called like steps in the pipeline? Task? I think sometimes there are different words for these, and I'm actually forgetting what they're called. But like they all together make up, all of these different jobs, let's say, make up a pipeline. Oops. All right. And that's all that I had to share today. I did want to leave up my contact information, like always, to see if folks want to chat with me about security stuff. Where each one feeds into the other, I think this is a question about the pipeline. Yes, each one does feed into each other. So if we're saying, another great question, and thank you. So, oops, let me go back. So if I look at this and I want to say that first I'm going to do the build, and then the build naturally would kind of feed into or trigger the test. All of this is just happening automatically. So yeah, kind of the successful completion of one of these steps or jobs would trigger the action of the next one. And I guess something else, like if that's not clear, if one of these steps fails, the pipeline will just fail. The pipeline will not complete. So if your build fails for whatever reason, then it's just going to stop there, if that wasn't clear either. Thank you all for joining me. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate the questions. I'll just say it one more time. Please reach out if you have any more questions on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on my email. I am happy to talk about this stuff more, to share more resources, as I'm kind of still learning myself. But yeah, thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you all take care and stay well, and I will see you for our last stream next week. Cheers.